All right, our attendees seem to have leveled off. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to Regulation Navigation, brought to you by ITS. This webinar series is centered around regulation-related topics that cover high-level compliance requirements and give an opportunity for you to learn something new, validate what you may already know, and ask questions affecting your operations. I'm Chris Taylor, the ITS Vice President of Learning and Product, and our conversation today will be centered on the American Petroleum Institute's Recommended Practice 1161 for operator qualification. The sixth edition is publishing soon, and we'll be discussing many significant changes and additions to the document. We'll also touch on some of the latest regulatory news for our industry. Before we get started, just some housekeeping items to ensure this experience is beneficial for all of you. This session will be recorded, and as a gentle reminder, the information and views expressed in this webinar series may be opinion and do not constitute legal advice and should not be utilized as your only source of information. So please review the disclaimer on screen before acting on any given advice and seek guidance from legal counsel or other applicable experts if you have particular questions, issues, or concerns. We'll have time, we'll have time at the end of the session where you can anonymously ask questions about the topics we discussed today. So please type your questions into the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll address those questions as time permits, or we'll respond to you through email if you leave your contact information. Also, we are now offering 0.1 CEUs. Those are continuing education units that you may be able to apply to your professional development hours. So after the webinar, we'll be sending out a feedback form that you can fill out and return to us if you would like a certificate for those CEU credits. We'll begin with an update on regulations, starting with a few recent announcements and movements from PHMSA. First, an update regarding the 2022 gas transmission final rule. PHMSA has completed regulatory changes to the federal code by removing and updating several sections, and this is after judicial review had vacated a number of provisions from that final rule. This included revisions or removal of portions of the following regulations: 192.478, 714, and 933 were all affected. These involve monitoring and mitigation of internal corrosive constituents, the repair criterion for cracks or crack-like anomalies with certain predicted failure pressures, and for high-frequency electric resistance welded seams needing immediate repair. So some of those were completely removed or amended. You'll see a link in the chat for more information, and we'll include that link as well in our follow-up blog post. With the new administration change in January, there is now a great amount of uncertainty about what's coming next with regulations, but here's what we know. On January 10th, PHMSA issued a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or an NPRM, for carbon dioxide pipelines, or CO2 pipelines. And in this notice was then removed from their site on January 20th, the day of the inauguration. Concerning issuance of the leak detection and repair final rule, PHMSA announced on January 16th that it had submitted the final rule to the Federal Registry. However, it was not published on the Federal Register prior to the administration change. And as a result, the posting announcement was immediately removed from PHMSA's website. And the rule is now currently under the review of the new administration per the Congressional Review Act. And this allows Congress to and the administration to review major rules issued by federal agencies before the rules take effect. And that essentially gives them up to 60 days using special procedures to review federal regulations that fall within that time frame. So that's where that one's at. Our friends at the American Public Gas Association shared that many industry concerns that were voiced at the Gas Pipeline Advisory Committee, or GPAC, meetings were in fact incorporated and considered into that final draft rule. For instance, Aaron Carilla recently wrote that gas distribution leak surveys in non-business district non-leaking pipe would stay on a 5-year cycle in that draft, and that there is significant flexibility in determining the environmental significance of a leak to ensure that operators don't have to purchase expensive equipment to measure leak volume. So sounds like industry was heard in that final draft, but at this stage, not much else is clear regarding the future of this rule, and we'll keep you informed the best we can as things come out. The American Public Gas Association also recently shared that PHMSA had a reduction of staff last month. So approximately 60 individuals were terminated from Department of Transportation's Volpe Center. In addition, PHMSA probationary staff, which means staff with less than 1 year of tenure, were not in a safety sensitive role, were let go. They also noted that some PHMSA personnel approaching or considering retirement took that, you saw it in the news, the fork in the road email option. And reportedly that also included Alan Mayberry, who led the Office of Pipeline Safety. So it's very likely that some great institutional knowledge has left the building. But moving on to today's topic, we're going to dive into what to expect with API's upcoming 6th edition. This is the Recommended Practice 1161 Hazardous Liquid Pipeline Operator Qualification, which is expected to be released soon. So with me is Chrystah Carter, the Health and Safety and Environment Training Supervisor for OQ and Competency at Plains. Chrystah has been in the midstream industry since 2013, serving in the regulatory compliance space prior to her current role. And Chrystah also serves as the chair of the API Recommended Practice 1161 OQ Working Group. Also with us is Scott Sanders. He's the Liquids Pipelines Technical Training Manager at Enbridge and the past chair of the API OQ Working Group. He joined Enbridge in 2013 after spending 20 years working for Weatherford International's wireline business unit. Thank you both for joining us today. The purpose of API's Recommended Practice 1161 is to provide guidance for developing and maintaining an operator qualification, or OQ, program that's compliant with OQ regulations. Chrystah and Scott, let's start with a high-level overview of why API's 1161 is an important document for pipeline operators. Can you tell us, how is it typically used by industry? How is this RP applied by operators and contractors alike? Chrystah?
Sure. Good morning. Recommended Practice 1161 provides a fantastic framework for developing and maintaining an OQ program for any hazardous liquid operator to utilize. It covers roughly 80% to meet PHMSA Subpart G requirements, while leaving the remaining 20% up to the operator. Operators may choose to use all or only a portion of this document as applicable to their operations.
Thanks. Scott, do you have other thoughts on the importance of the document?
I think from my perspective, in addition to what Chrystah said, it represents an important collaboration for different industry players. So whether it's people in the training space, it's operating companies, and even the regulator, to come together and to work together to create that list of potential covered tasks and then support it with task standards. So it's something that we couldn't do independently as independent operators. I think that it represents 25 years worth of pretty valuable work for industry to utilize.
Well put. As an OQ vendor, ITS uses 1161 as the structural backbone, if you will, that underpins our hazardous liquids program. It informs the task codes and the task naming conventions, as well as the scope of most of the tasks found in our program, which in turn, informs the training, the content itself, the knowledge, testing, the skill evaluations, and it's used by operators and contractors alike. I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of 1161. And as we stated before, it's going to be its sixth edition. It's expected to publish soon. And the first edition was published, as you said, Scott, 25 years ago. In fact, this new edition will now feature a newly drafted introduction with a detailed overview of that history. Scott, knowing you weren't there from the beginning, can you paint a picture of the origin and the evolution of the OQ rule itself and then of this document?
Yeah, sure. I I think is the story is actually very well told in the preamble to the publication of the rule in 1999. It gives the regulatory history. If people are interested, I'd recommend that you read that. The other reason I would recommend that you read that is if you're ever contesting a finding related to OQ and really any other regulation, they're going to go back when they're adjudicating that to the actual preamble to understand the intent of the rule. So I think it's important for the organization or different organizations and for industry to be grounded in that space. And from an OQ perspective, it actually goes back to 1992 and the original Pipeline Safety Act. And then the precursor to PHMSA, the OPS at the time, issued a notice of proposed rulemaking. They got a lot of comment back from different people out there in industry and what have you. And then ultimately they pulled the notice of proposed rulemaking and they went with something called the negotiated rulemaking process, which I think is important for us to realize as industry today when we're trying to decide what we want to do with this API publication, what we want to do with OQ going forward. Negotiated rulemaking is just that. It means that there's different parties at the table at the time. So the Office of Pipeline Safety, aka PHMSA, was in the room. The AGA was in the room, as were a number of other different gas associations. API was there, representing the liquids operators. The industry groups representing firefighters and different NGOs were all participating, and they created this final rule. And then now we have the publication of the rule and the 4-part test. And so then a lot of it shifted to the actual interpretation of the 4-part test. So growing out of that effort, what actually happened is after the rule was published, API put together something called the Consortium on Operator Qualification, also known as the Kooks Group. And that was the original group that started coming up with the covered task list for a future API publication, which is now this document. So the original publication came out shortly after the publication of the rule in 1999. And it included, it was actually in August 2000, it included 45 initial tasks. And so all that was provided at the time was the task name. So they came up with the different task names. There were no task standards which provide a description of what it means to accomplish the task. And then as we work our way through the second edition in 2012, the task list expanded to 99 tasks. And they started creating these task standards. And why are task standards important? Well, the name's important. That's the high-level description of what's happening. But the task standard is basically, from a learning perspective, your knowledge, skills, and abilities. It's what do you actually have to know and what do you actually have to do to be able to demonstrate proficiency performing that task. That's vital information for anybody developing training and qualification materials, whether it's ITS or another training vendor, or whether it's an independent operator doing their own work. So Chrystah mentioned a minute ago here that it gets you 80% of the way That's because 80% of what we do is generic across industry. It's still important to fine tune it to that 20% that's unique to how your organization performs that work. But the generic outcome statement, I think, is extremely valuable. In January 2014, the third edition came out. There was standardization done in terms of how the task names were actually written, basically verbs first for all intents and purposes. The fourth edition came out in February 2019, and that's where that was the first edition where all of the task standards or all the tasks listed had a task standard published. So that was an important addition. Fifth edition added MOC guidance for management of change, and then also some guidance on how to identify AOCs, which is always a point of conversation at our committee meetings. And then the sixth edition, where we've done general updates and made a number of different changes that I think are going to be discussed through this meeting. So I maybe won't touch on all of those. But the task list did expand from 100 tasks to 120 tasks. So we're going to have more discussion on where that came from. So hopefully that provides a reasonable overview of why we are where we are today and why the OQ rule works better when we collaborate.
Yes, I think that was a really good overview of its history. Thank you, Scott. As far as the significant changes in this sixth edition go, first of all, the title of the document itself had a slight revision. So it's now specifying hazardous liquid. The focus of 1161 has now narrowed to hazardous liquid tasks, and references to gas assets that are regulated by 49 CFR 192 have been removed from this new edition. Chrystah, can you tell us more about that direction?
Sure. So the CFR 192 references related to gas have all been removed from RP 1161. The working group voted and approved this change as we felt like shifting the focus strictly to 195 liquids would strengthen the RP. There is another group, B31Q, who does focus more on gas, so we're able to prevent any contradictions as well as really shift to a focus of liquids. And the revised title narrows in on this shift towards strictly liquids.
Thank you. I believe, as Scott mentioned, it went from 100 to now it's going to go to 120 tasks. So as many as 20 tasks are now added into the sixth edition. Chrystah, can you tell us more about the process the committee uses to identify covered tasks?
Sure. Because the OQ working group comprises so many industry operators, we have the luxury of receiving input and updates from across the board. As new discoveries are made or as questions arise, we can bring that to the table in open discussion. And then as enforcements are given to operators, the working group assesses the materiality and asks for input from the operator who actually received the enforcement. And then discussion is had about how that should or should not impact the RP 1161. All of the 8 new performance-based tasks were based on enforcement of operators. And then separate from performance-based tasks, other new covered tasks, such as the underwater tasks, were voted and approved as their procedure steps are materially different than the above water similar task. In addition to this, as an industry body, we also engage directly with the regulator. We invite them to attend our quarterly meetings, which they have. And we have even presented alongside of them at the API conference, where we were able to better understand their stance on certain enforcements and guidance. And then lastly, we seek input from industry operator SMEs as we're reviewing existing covered tasks. So as a result, for example, 6th edition will separate an existing covered task for installing electrical insulating devices into 4 tasks, focused on the specific type of insulating device. So many different ways.
Yeah, I think, so of those 20, really, there was one task before that became 4, 16 newer ones, I believe, sort of. So as we can see on screen, kind of the breakdown here, 6 are underwater based tasks. There's a new method of non-destructive testing Launching and receiving devices, also known as pigging, has returned. It was in a previous edition, and now it's now again in the 6th edition. And many other new tasks focused on activities needed to facilitate pipeline repair stand out to me. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, and as you can see in the list, and as I last mentioned, there's now that separation of the former 9.6 covered tasks for installing electrical insulating devices into those 4 tasks. And as you can see here, you have piping isolation, casing isolation, isolation joints, and lightning protection and electrical grounding.
So related to the pipeline repairs in particular, I had the pleasure of being a part of the 1161 OQ working group, and there was a significant, committee discussion over many meetings, distinguishing essentially an interpretation of regulation, performance versus prescriptive. Um, and so looking at 195.422, this is the pipeline repairs regulation as an example. Chrystah, can you explain more about this concept of performance versus prescription?
Yeah, so up until a few years ago, API and operators focused on what we call prescriptive-based tasks. And so as you can see in the screen here, we use the 4-part test, and in order to become a covered task, it has to say yes to all 4 of those, 1 through 4. And if you focus in on number 3 there, is performed as a requirement of this part, we took that to be literal. And so as an example of a prescriptive-based task, we have 195.420 for valve maintenance. Within that specific regulation, the citation, it says each operator must inspect each valve to determine that it is functioning properly. And therefore, we created task 20 for inspect mainline valves. However, due to PHMSA's FAQ and some of the enforcements in which operators have been receiving, they've been citing the 192.422 regulation. And if we could switch to the next screen there for the example, thank you. So just an example of what we mean by performance-based, and what they've been citing with 192.422 for pipeline repairs. As you can see here, it's pretty general. Each operator shall, in repairing its pipeline systems, ensure that the repairs are made in a safe manner and are made so as to prevent damage to persons or property. So we have to look at that and really determine what constitutes a pipeline repair. That could be a number of tasks. And PHMSA even uses the term performance-based within their guidance. So the FAQ 9 says for performance-based regulations such as 195.422 pipeline repairs, tasks are performed as a requirement of this part if they are integral to meeting the requirements of the regulations. And so they're citing back to that 4-part test, number 3 of that 4-part test. And just some examples here, they're considering pipe fitting and removal of casing to make repairs. So there's a number of enforcements that have been issued, and full transparency on their website if you'd like to see more on that. So it is a shift from the prescriptive language regulatory citations to the more encompassing regulations.
Yeah, very well explained. Yeah.
I
So
will say Scott has a very good way that I would love to hear his input on this, because he has a really great way of stating if everything's safety critical, then nothing's safety critical. And I love that quote, Scott, that you say. So curious if you have more to add on that.
Oh, you stole my thunder. No, I think that's true. If you can go back one slide, because there's so much conversation around the interpretation of the 4-part test, and Chrystah touched on the literal interpretation versus a more broad performance-based interpretation. And what we're seeing from the regulator when they are issuing enforcement action, and then the FAQ, because the FAQ that we just showed essentially quotes enforcement action language when it goes to an administrative hearing that's adjudicated by a lawyer from PHMSA, actually. And then they're actually going back and quoting the preamble to the final rule. And they're calling out that in that preamble, the original rule was always intended to be a performance-based rule. So the reason I wanted to go to this slide is you look at that 4-part test and you talk about part 3. Is it performed as a requirement of this part? I mean, that could be interpreted very narrowly, which is what we had done in the past with the prescriptive interpretation, as Chrystah covered. But it can be interpreted much more broadly, where if you have to perform something to actually achieve the outcome that's listed in the rule, all of those little somethings need to be analyzed. And you need to determine if they meet the bar to be a 4-part test. So if you interpret step 3 very broadly, then you have to do your due diligence to make sure when you're looking at step 1, 2, and 4, most notably step 4, that you are really narrowing that list down to the things that matter. So if everything affects the operation or integrity of the pipeline, then nothing does. So that's sort of that safety critical notion. You have to start doing your due diligence there, because your task list can't be 1,000 tasks, or it's just going to get pencil whipped at the field level. It has to be meaningful and valuable to operations, and it has to also, to meet the intent of the original rule, reduce the likelihood of human error causing harm to people, property, and the environment. So that's where the conversation essentially shifts, and it becomes so important to really have your finger on that safety critical concept and an understanding of that.
Yeah, that is a very meaningful and gets right to the point. You know, if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. That's something you always hear, and it's the same here, right? For programs. So, in all, what I'm hearing is that a simple way of putting this: operators have been receiving enforcement actions for not having certain covered tasks, and such as, let's say, a grinding task, repair. And the recommended practice is now responding to that and providing a task standard. Is that fair, Chrystah?
It is. We sometimes are asked what tasks we foresee being added next due to enforcements, and our response is that we're actively trying to seek engagement with PHMSA and have the open dialogue or continue the open dialogue so the industry can be more proactive with this rather than reactive against enforcement. And as a caveat, as we were already, as Scott had already kind of touched on, is we really want to focus in on those safety critical tasks and not open the door to these covered task lists becoming 300 plus task long, right?
So, yeah, I mean, again, it's like not everything needs to be a task. With this new edition of 1161, what is the committee hoping that regulators take away from it, do you think? Scott?
Sure, I can take that one. As Chrystah just mentioned again here, we're responding to enforcement action to inform tasks that should be included in the list. So, I mean, long story short, if there's an enforcement action, we know it matters to PHMSA, and so then it matters to industry because there'll likely be future enforcement actions. So those are tasks that we're going to add pretty much automatically, although they are subject to due diligence within the committee and the committee vote to make sure that we feel that they meet the bar of safety critical work. But if you go back and you look at sort of the arc of history for the OQ rule, it started, from all intents and purposes, as a collaborative process. And I'll also mention that there was a major incident on the Olympic pipeline in the 90s that resulted in the death of three boys, and that was one of the final impetuses that said, hey, listen, we have to collaborate, we have to get this done, we have to get this over the finish line, because pipeline safety matters to operating companies, it matters to the regulator, it matters to people in the public, and there are real consequences if we don't get it right. So I think what I would really like to see is a more proactive approach, where we're not we're not reactive. We're not waiting for enforcement action. But at the same time, we're not opening the floodgates, because we have to keep part of the power of the OQ rule is the fact that it is focused, and it does, for all intents and purposes, deliver value to the industry. So it's, how do you identify the next 10 tasks, say, that really matter and would really make a difference, yet still meet the 4-part test? The work is still performed as required by the regulation. So how can we work together again and sort of close that arc and get back to the point where, there's healthy debate, but the focus is always on reducing the likelihood of human error causing harm to people, property, the environment. That would be what I'd like to see.
Well put. Well put. This new edition ensures that task-specific abnormal operating conditions, or AOCs, are listed in each task. Scott, how has the recommended practice evolved over its additions in its treatment of AOCs?
AOCs are a hard topic,
Yeah.
actually, to be truthful, because abnormal operating conditions are so similar to abnormal operations because they essentially grew out of abnormal operations. So we've oscillated as a committee where we've included a lot of things that are an abnormal operating condition to a very strict interpretation of what it means to be an abnormal operating condition, and then now back to a looser definition. Again, it's shifting back to that intent of preparing somebody to perform work and to do it in a manner that reduces the likelihood of causing harm to people, property, the environment. So an AOC, in a nutshell, if you step away from the regulatory definition, is essentially the what ifs. It's you're performing work according to a specific task step, but you need to be able to recognize the difference between something that's going according to plan and something that's not. And then you need to take action. And usually that action is notifying somebody. So an abnormal operation typically is a deviation from a set standard. I think you have a flow chart here probably coming up that gives sort of a bit of that information. So an AO fundamentally is a component malfunction or deviation from normal operation that either exceeds design limits or causes a potential hazard. That's an AO. That's the definition, the regulation of an AO. The only distinction for an AOC is it may have happened. So each of those things may be occurring. You need to recognize that they may be occurring. As soon as you know they are occurring, you then have to execute a procedure, which is what the AO rule is all about, having procedures for abnormal operations. So essentially what we're doing is we're saying, if it's an emergency, you have to execute a procedure. If it's an AO, you have to execute a procedure, which means you have to write a procedure for those different things. But there's probably an infinitesimal point in time where you're recognizing that something may not be going according to plan before you know that it isn't. And it's that infinitesimal moment that we're going to call the AOC. So it still has to meet component definition or component malfunction or deviation from normal operations, and it has to result in the potential exceedance of design limits or a potential hazard. Then once we know that, we just say, is it related to task performance? And if it is, then we're going to add it to the task-specific AOC list, because we want to list AOCs unique to each individual task. If it's just generic in nature, fire, explosion, soiling on the right of way as a result of, oil out of your pipe or potentially oil out of your pipe, we would put it on a general AOC list. And provide generic training to individuals in that space. So just anybody that's working out there as part of pipeline operations, if you see something, you need to say something. Usually say something's making a phone call, and or you're completing an operation or a procedure, or somebody else in the organization is executing that procedure. So a lot of things that we didn't have a task or on the task specific AOC list in the past edition are being published now. One of the examples or main differences between the last interpretation of this one is if you were looking for something as part of the task steps and then you found it, we would just reference that in the explanation and then not include it on the AOC list. But if you're looking for something that isn't aligned with how that thing should be, we'll actually include it in the task specific AOC list now. So it'll appear in a couple of places. I mean, the core intent is to drive training, usually knowledge-based training for people that are performing these tasks to be able to recognize when things aren't going according to plan and to know what to do about it. That's really what AOC is all about.
Thank you. That's a really great explanation. The difference between an AO and AOC, that I love how you put it, that infinitesimal point in time of recognizing and knowing how to react. What's the difference? A lot of times we try to get some real basics here. What's the difference between, in definition, an emergency versus an admiral operation?
Things can be an AOC and then become an AO and then become an emergency, or they can just skip all the steps. I mean, if you have a full line rupture on a pipeline,
Right.
that's an emergency. If you have fire explosion, that's an emergency. And then you're executing emergency procedures. If you have a valve going closed on a pipeline uncommanded, when you think that's happening, that's an AOC. When you know it's happening, that's an AO. But if you can react in time, it hopefully won't become an emergency. So, and there's a lot of examples of that sort of thread that can result in things happening. So the idea is to pick it up as soon as possible and to react and respond. I don't know if that helps you.
I think so, yeah. And with this new effort or with the effort that involved in the getting to the sixth edition and listing task-specific AOCs, in the previous editions, there were many that just had this space intentionally left blank, something like that. And sometimes I think there was a misinterpretation of like, well, not ever any AOCs that would ever occur in this. And like you said, the purpose to put them and list them just to elevate the knowledge, especially for people that are not familiar with the industry, inexperienced, for training providers like ITS, to use that as a basis. Has been really helpful. Another thing to kind of note, if you guys, the audience, you saw the diagram, if you go back one on the diagram, the whole process is much simpler now, is really streamlined in this new edition. So where there's less steps determining emergency and AO, et cetera, those have been removed essentially. And then as we were just seeing on screen, and again now, it's streamlined. It's much simpler. So thank you for touching on AOCs. API's addition of a whole new appendix. Now, Annex H, is now going to be available in the sixth edition for establishing span of control and evaluation intervals. And it outlines 3 steps to establish those. Chrystah, can you walk us through those?
Yeah, Annex H provides a helpful tool for operators and training providers to use. With SME input, you want to first determine a cover task risk level, as you can see in step 1 there. Once that's determined, you'll then select the task difficulty level. And then from here, it provides suggestions for span of control and interval. But some may want to also consider frequency, which is not shown on this figure here.
So Annex H, there's a new annex. It prompts operators to assess a task risk and assess task difficulty. And it recommends, using subject matter experts, involving them. How do you see and operate, or maybe give us a picture of what is the typical process an operator uses SMEs and their input for this process. Chrystah, could you perhaps give us like a scenario or kind of illustrate the use of SMEs that could follow this guidance?
When we seek SME input, this is because they have the technical knowledge and skills regarding the task. They've either performed it themselves. They're the point person out in the field, boots on the ground, and so they should be able to easily determine the risk and difficulty related to a particular task. So, for instance, when we're reviewing a corrosion-related task, you would seek out a corrosion SME to walk you through this analysis or similar. Some may utilize an internal working group to assist with this effort. And then just as a side note, utilizing a survey application can help easily track and document the rankings for this. So if you have SMEs, almost like a vote, you can easily pull that data together to track the span of control and interval.
And then you can use that data as kind of also here's evidence we did this, right? I guess,
Exactly.
yeah. I mean,
Yes.
we always say on this show, we try to say it every single time. If you don't document it, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Well, moving forward, I believe that recommended practice 1161 is adopting a new publishing model, which allows for updates. I mean, it's been 5 years since, or so since fifth edition, and now this is going to allow for updates to be released as addendums in between official major editions. So do you anticipate the industry will be seeing updates more often from the group?
I don't think the industry should expect any more updates than usual as far as number. Alternatively, they will receive the updates much quicker, so the information will be received by industry sooner. Previously, changes were made and then set on for years before being published. However, with this new model, those changes will be made available very soon after being voted on and approved.
So it may feel like there's more because it's happening more frequently, but about not taking any more, not anticipating taking on any more work or publishing more. That makes sense. So the OQ working group, we meet 4 times a year at various locations throughout the country, and they're typically either at an operator location or at API's, one of their headquarters or one of their sites. Can you give us a picture of what typical meetings like?
Yeah, and we usually, to your note, Chris, we do usually, I would say, once a year meet in DC at API's office there. Otherwise, it's usually an operator hosting at their headquarters. But the quarterly meetings are 2.5 days, Tuesday through Thursday. So usually people will travel in on a Monday afternoon and travel back on a Thursday afternoon. But we begin the meeting with a general session. So everyone is in the room on day one when we start. And that typically goes until lunch, and then we'll break into our separate working group sessions for the afternoon. But during the general session, we review and approve the agenda, the previous meeting minutes, we review any outstanding ballots, and then we'll have a PHMSA update. And typically we try to get that directly from PHMSA, but it may be an operator member that gives that update as well. The second day mostly consists of a continuation of the working group sessions. And then at the end of day 2, the policy group, which is the API members only, will meet for a discussion. Sometimes there's a vote or items that need to be discussed. And then day 3 consists of bringing everyone back together for another general session for report outs from each working group lead. We share the outcomes from the policy group meeting, and then there's discussion of future meetings and priorities. And then we'll also at the very end ask for meeting feedback just to continue improving. We're always improving as best we can.
And it's like the original collaboration Scott described. I feel like that to some degree happens every single meeting where you have operator input, contractor input, regulatory input, vendor input, and discussion, debate. You get to know what's happening. It's invaluable and great networking opportunity. I've found it myself to be a very great resource to learn and grow in. How can folks that may be interested, members of the industry, become involved with the OQ working group?
The OQ working group membership is open to anyone interested. Anyone with a direct or material interest in liquid pipeline operations and maintenance activity is welcome. Pipeline operating companies, third-party training providers, and representatives from regulatory agencies are specifically encouraged to participate. If you are interested, you can reach out to myself. I'm happy to provide my contact information or one of our operator or API advisors. And then just as a side note, we're always looking for SMEs. So if you're interested in participating as an SME, we would greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chrystah and Scott, for sharing your expertise here. This again was just a high-level overview of what's coming in the 6th edition. There's more. We just hit on some of the significant points. And it's time now that you have an opportunity to enter your questions that you may have for our guests here in the Q&A feature in Zoom. So if we run out of time, which we're looking good on time right now, we'll be sure to follow up with you after the webinar. But first, let's recap our top 5 takeaways. So takeaway number 1, the 6th edition of API Recommended Practice 1161 will be publishing soon, shifting the focus to solely be on liquids and adding future updates as addendums in between editions. And number 2, this new edition of 1161 has 20 additional tasks, including those related to pipeline repair and those performed underwater. And 1161, number 3, 1161 has broadened its scope and shifted its focus with the addition of many performance-based tasks in response to regulatory enforcement action. And the working group is being proactive, engaging with regulators. This new edition now has task-specific AOCs listed for every task. And lastly, there is now guidance for span of control and evaluation intervals, establishing those through a 3-step process that assesses the risk of the task, assesses its difficulty and frequency, as Chrystah mentioned, and then determining what the appropriate span of control and the evaluation interval is for your operations or program. So that's that in a nutshell, kind of what to expect with 6th edition. Don't forget about the opportunity for obtaining continuing education unit credits. We'll be sending out a feedback form that you can fill out, and you can return it to ITS if you would like a certificate for those CEU credits. Also, it's not too early to begin planning to come and attend the ITS User Conference hosted in Nashville, Tennessee, this September 30th through October 1st. We'll be at the Downtown Hilton. That's about 1 block from Broadway. A roaring good time at some honky tonks. And our user conference is a great opportunity to level up on best practices, get your hands on the latest features of ITS products that you could use for your OQ program. You'll learn from other operators and other contractors that face the same challenges you do, and you can keep up with the latest industry innovations from vendors that'll be on site. So mark it on your calendar. Registration will be available starting April 1st on the ITS website. So stay tuned for that. At this time, we'd like to talk through any questions you have. Looks like we have a couple. So if you haven't done so yet, please enter a question into the Q&A feature in Zoom. And again, if we don't get to your question here on air, we'll be sure to follow up with you individually. So I guess question number 1 to Chrystah or Scott, when will the 6th edition be published and available for purchase?
Sure. We expect the 6th edition to be published during Q2. API is currently updating the links within the document, and then it will be released. So very soon in Q2.
Are there other, here's another one. Are there other repair tasks that are still needing to be identified or being considered by the working group? I guess which one do you?
Scott, do you want to take that one?
Sure.
It's been a minute.
I would say there are other tasks being considered by the group. It kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier in the conversation. The performance-based rule or interpretation of the rule doesn't just expand to include section 422 of 49 CFR 195, which is pipeline repair. It's basically looking at the entire regulation and determining if there are other tasks related to the performance of something that's listed in the regulation that we should consider from a safety critical perspective, where improper performance could impact, people, property, the environment, or using the fourth part of the 4-part test could impact the operation or integrity of the pipeline. So yeah, anything's open. If people have ideas for tasks that should be considered, I would say send them our way or come to the meeting and bring them forward for consideration.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah, that would be fantastic for further involvement. Another question, underwater and above ground tasks. I know it was mentioned that they're materially different, but they seem to be the same thing just about though, like from a task name standpoint, but why are they separate tasks? What was determined there? Chrystah, you want to take that one or?
Sure. So yes, the task name itself is basically the same. However, the procedure steps within the task, underwater versus above water, are materially different. And so as an industry body that we decided to separate them out so that we could capture those individual specific procedure steps.
Great. And a question here, they missed the beginning. So just to address that, this session is recorded and will be published on the ITS website. We have a whole section on our website for RegNav webinars, where you can also sign up to make sure you get the next one as well. If you came in from, social media, et cetera, you can get on an email list there as well. But so you can catch the beginning if you missed some of it. But the question is, how will natural gas OQ now be supported by API?
So for RP 1161, the 192 references have been removed. However, there are other groups that do focus on gas that are open the same way API OQ working group is open to participants. But just as an example, we have B31Q who focuses on gas. So definitely reaching out to them. But for the purposes of RP 1161, we'll strictly focus on liquids going forward.
Yeah, well put. Then that's the American Society of Mechanical Engineering, ASME, B31Q. And if you're interested in that, you can always reach out to ITS. We can get you connected with them in that group as well. So please do if you're interested or need to know more information. They cover a little bit of liquids. A very small portion of tasks do cover liquids still in that standard, but its main focus is natural gas. Here's another question. So if this new edition, this recommended practice 1161, 6th edition is published in Q2, how long do operators have to implement training for the new OQs? And when do employees need to have certification for the new covered tasks? And I know from experience that will really be determined by what your OQ plan and program says, right? Do you have anything to add to that, Chrystah or Scott?
I can take that one, and Scott, if you have anything to add, please do. So RP 1161 is not incorporated by reference, so the regulator, as things are added or updated, they really can't hold you to that. I know there's operators who very, very strictly follow RP 1161, and there's others that just use it as kind of a guide or a base. So it really is dependent on how you utilize the document and what your OQ plan says, as Chris mentioned. So I think you determine that within your own company. And then I would also say that always do an analysis to make sure, as API adds covered tasks, make sure that you're also doing an analysis against your operations to make sure that task is applicable to your operations, and really, utilizing your SMEs for their feedback as well. I think is helpful in that.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Chrystah.
I think the
Yeah,
only
go
thing
ahead.
I would add is just recognizing that the regulation is written so that each operating company has to have their own OQ program. You can't just adopt an off-the-shelf product without doing your due diligence. So API is a guidance document, and that's it. One of the reasons we're trying to reduce the cycle time between enforcement action and the publication of a new task is so that as soon as the enforcement action's done, really that's the regulator has communicated to the regulated community that they consider that a covered task. It's the onus falls to each operator to figure out whether or not they do that work, and then they would need to resolve that issue or potential deficiency in the OQ program before it's probably going to work its way through API and then to vendor companies. So that's why the cycle time is important, to give operating companies that tool. But yeah, as Chrystah stated, it's not incorporated by reference. So there is, you could choose not to implement any or all of RP 1161.
And I can just add from an ITS perspective with our own OQ program, we will be waiting until we can acquire that new edition. It has to be published. And then we'll be doing due diligence to affect or create new covered tasks appropriately depending on our members' needs. So great question. Thank you for asking that. And that's all the questions we have. So again, Chrystah, Scott, I can't thank you enough for spending your time with us today, sharing your expertise, and helping us give a preview to industry and those interested and attended this webinar. Thank you to our audience today for joining us online. Please mark your calendars for our next regulation navigation webinar. Subject to be determined. We'll always try to make it timely and relevant, but that is tentatively scheduled for Wednesday, June 11th, and stay tuned for more on that. And please stay safe out there. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.